Now on to the next one. So the next one really isn't a question. It was more of a request. And so the request was expound on Romans chapter 2, verses 14 through 15. So, Romans chapter 2, verse number 14 and 15 says this. It says, "Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them." Okay, so kind of expounding on this. We've been talking last couple of weeks about context, right? And so this is a good way for us to look, take a verse and kind of look at it in context of what's going on. Because I think that so many times people will just simply want to take one verse of the Bible and they think that the Bible is just simply a collection of religious sayings. And it really is not. The Bible is a collection of books. And so you need to understand is that, hey, when you got a book, you've got context of the book. And so here is the book of Romans, which is a letter that Paul wrote to the Christians that were at Rome. Paul had never been to Rome at this point. Now, later on, he's going to get to Rome in his life, but this is before the shipwreck. This is before Caesarea Philippi and spending 2 years in prison. This is before going to Jerusalem and being, a mob rioting and being arrested by the Romans. So this is before all that. This is when God inspired him to write this letter. And so he's writing this letter to the Christians that are at Rome, and he's really kind of introducing himself, but not really, I won't even say introducing himself so much because, he knows about them and they know about him, but he's really writing to say, hey, I want to come see you very soon, and he is going to be laying out something about the gospel message. As a matter of fact, if we take a look at chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, we kind of see a little bit about what the theme of it is about the letter. He says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation of everyone who believes. First for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." So that's quotation from the book of Habakkuk. And the idea about the righteous is going to live by faith, that's really kind of going to be the theme throughout the entire letter. First of all, it's going to be a theme about the righteous living spiritually, eternally by faith. That is, that we have faith in Jesus Christ, and therefore righteousness is credited to us from God. So we don't have a righteousness of ourselves from our good works and following the law. We have a righteousness that God gives to us by the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ. Okay? So that's going to be a lot of the book of Romans. But in addition to that, it's going to be the last part of the book of Romans is going to be that the righteous or the just are going to be living by faith. In other words, based on that faith that we have in Christ, that's how we're going to be living and conducting our lives. Okay? And so all the way through from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 16, we pretty much find that kind of theme that's involved. Now, before he starts to get into this idea about salvation by grace through faith, which really doesn't start to kick in until the middle of chapter 3, before that, he's going to be talking about the universality of sin. And the reason for it is, when we think about the gospel message, what does the word gospel mean?
Good news.
Good news. And so if something's good news, how can it first have destruction and condemnation in it, right? Well, here's the thing. In order for somebody to be saved, don't they have to be lost?
Yeah.
Before somebody can, be delivered and rescued, they've got to have a situation of despair. And so here's this idea about the universality of sin. If he's going to be talking about here is the salvation of the Jew first, and then the Gentiles second. He's got to say, okay, we've got to have the Jews understand, we've got to have the Gentiles understand, so that we can have a joint Savior in the person of Jesus Christ. Okay? And so starting in chapter 1, verse number 18, he really starts to talk about the ancient Gentile world. And it's kind of a good thing that we had that last question about, the Gentile world and how, we've got the flood and we've got all these different accounts and everything like that. Because I want you to be thinking about that as we look at what happened to this ancient Gentile world. What we see is that just kind of starting out in verses 18 and 19, 20, is that here this world is, and the wrath of God is being revealed against all this wickedness because the things that are about God, it's very plain, it's very obvious, and that God has made it that way so that people are without excuse. And then look at verse number 21, because this is going to be explaining a little bit about why that world was the way it was. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. And so, if you think about Ham, Shem, and Japheth, did they have a knowledge of God? Oh, yeah. If you lived where you just saw the destruction of the world and you were spared, you and your wives were spared by being on the ark, and you're following your dad, Noah, and you're getting off the ark and you're sacrificing, you've got a knowledge of God. And it's probably going to be very important for you to go and pass that knowledge on to your children, right? And emphasize it, Hey, this is the way that the world was, and God destroyed the world because of wickedness. So, and then they're going to pass it on, and they're going to pass it on, they're going to pass it on. The knowledge of God in the ancient world was pretty intact, okay? And so there was something that happened to that knowledge of God. And what it says here is that they knew God, but they didn't glorify him as God or give thanks to him. And so there's the first step right there. They don't give thanks to God for his goodness. And secondly, they don't honor God for who he really is. Right? Now, when you think about our world today, our society today, do we not see that? Where people are not giving God the honor that is properly due him, number one. And number two, they're really not being thankful for the things that God has done for them. I think that really does go hand in hand. If we don't honor God for who God is, then we're not going to be thankful for the blessings that he gives to us. And if we're not going to be thankful for the blessings that God gives to us, then we're going to be looking at life and we're going to be very dissatisfied with things, right? And so when we lose sight of that, then all of a sudden it starts to be this, very futile way of thinking, and our understanding is becoming darkened. And so these people, it says that they claim to be wise, but they became fools, and they started to participate in idolatry. So if you're not going to recognize God as God, what are you going to recognize as God? Right? I mean, even, if you look at like atheists and agnostics, and they're going to say, well, I don't recognize anything as God. But what about yourself? If you're going to be an atheist or agnostic, you're probably going to be putting yourself up on that same pedestal. Maybe not as the almighty creator, but you can be saying, hey, since there is no God, I have the power and the authority to make my own decisions and do what I want and chart my own way. Okay? And so you can kind of see a little bit about where these people were coming from. And because they did that, and they started to gradually, over the course of centuries and centuries, lose sight of who God really was, then as they were becoming more and more futile in their thinking and darkened in their understanding, you need to understand that that's going to be paving the way for their increased immorality. Going down through verses 24 through verse number 27, we see how now homosexuality starts to come into play. But I want us to focus in on verse number 28, where it says, "Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. They become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless." Does that sound like what our society is becoming?
Yeah, I mean, you could put that in today's headlines, and everybody would say, yep, that's what's going on.
Exactly. I mean, and we say, oh, well, there's not been a time like this. Yeah, there has. You can look back in history and you can see it through and through and through and through. And any time we don't put God in his rightful place, then we start to engage in this kind of darkened understanding, and God eventually gets to the point that he says, okay, if this is the route that you guys want to go, fine, go for it. And then all of a sudden, all bets are off. Okay? And not only that, but we look at the last verse there, verse number 32. It says, "Although they know God's righteous decrees that those that do such things deserve death, and they not only continue to do these various things, but also approve of those who practice them." So it's kind of like, yeah, let's get our cheerleading section going here. Yay! You're doing wickedness. You're doing evil. Go for it. You are, a real man. You're a real woman. You're a real human being. You're living your best life. Okay. We see that today too.
Yeah.
Now, don't we? Okay, so there's the Gentile world. So you can kind of see that, and again, Paul's writing in Romans. The Roman Christians, probably the majority of them are Jews there. They're probably looking around at all the Romans and going, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. But in chapter 2, now he's going to pull Jews into it. And so in chapter 2, he says, "You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge the other, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things." Oh, how interesting, And so here we've got a situation where the Romans are going off and doing all the ungodly things they're doing, and meanwhile the Jews are sitting back and going, "You bad, awful, terrible Romans, God's going to get you," and they're not really looking at themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. Now he goes on to talk about the idea about how the Jews have the law, and the Jews are going to be having the law, which is going to give them an advantage, because especially if we think about that that little timeline that I drew up earlier. Like this. You've got the flood, you've got all the people stepping off the boat. Centuries later, you've got this whole mass of stories that are perversions and, distortions about this great worldwide calamity called the flood. And then all of a sudden, we've got the Bible that is going to be jumping in and telling people the truth. And so who was it that was being told the truth? The Jews, because after all, the flood account, the creation account, Tower of Babel account, all the other things are all part of the law. Okay? This is the Old Testament. So you can see the Jews have got an advantage because they're getting the record set straight. They're being told about who God is, they're being told about what God wants, and they're being told about God's righteousness. Right? Okay. But it's not enough to just simply hear it, they've got to also do it. If they hear it but don't do it, they're not any better off than somebody who never heard it but still does it. Okay? And so now we kind of come down to verse number 12. And so here we've got this idea about the Jews had the law, and really the purpose of the law was to point out their sin. It wasn't to make them righteous, but to point out their sin. And so how can the Gentiles be judged if they don't have the law to point that out? And so we come down to verse 12. Chapter 2, verse 12, it says, all you who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. So there's the Gentiles, right? Gentiles, you don't have the law. But when you sin apart from the law, you're going to still perish apart from the law. And all that sin under the law will be judged by the law. There's the Jews, right? Because it says in verse 13, for it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Now, in verse number 14, and the NIV puts this in little parentheses, and it is kind of a parenthetical statement. He just simply kind of explains a little bit. He says, indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written in their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness. So here's the Gentiles, and the Gentiles, they don't have the law, but at the same time, there's something that is kind of implanted and embedded in them, really left over from the creation and carried through from the fall. And that is that they have this idea about, hey, there's right and there's wrong, and I could be held accountable for my actions of right and wrong. Now, their ideas about right and wrong may not be exactly correct, but at the same time, looking at the big picture, they've got a pretty good understanding. When you look at humanity, and I know that we've had some very wicked and evil times down throughout the centuries, but even in the wicked and evil times, people pretty much said, this is evil and wicked. We just don't care about it. We're going to do it anyway. But when you look down throughout the centuries, down throughout any culture, just globally, you see a very universal pattern of conduct, right? I mean, just about any culture that you go to, adultery is wrong. Murder is wrong. Theft is wrong. Lying is wrong. I mean, of course, you've got those cultures that may not share those traits, but just simply globally, you've got that. And at the same time, when you look globally and you look even, back down through the centuries, you've got people understanding that there is a higher power out there. There is a God out there, or there is gods out there, or there is somebody that we could make mad. There's somebody who could judge us. There is somebody that we've got to appease, or somebody that we're going to be holding to account. And so you can kind of see, here's this idea about the law is kind of written on the Gentiles' hearts, and at the same time, that conscience that they have is kicking in, And so when they're sinning, the conscience is there is saying, I wonder what God thinks about this. I wonder what God's going to do. Now, maybe they don't have the details right, but they've got that conscience that is in place. And so as we continue on down, it says that this conscience is bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them. And so here's these conscience and thoughts saying, you know what? Maybe I better straighten up. Maybe I need to change. Maybe I need to do something else. Or, just simply saying, you know what? I see somebody else doing something wrong, and I'm glad I'm not that guy. Okay? And so you can kind of see where all this is going to be working. And, going back, this is why I want to go back into chapter 1, is that they knew God originally. They started to not honor God for who He was. They're not giving thanks to God. And there's where that thinking starts to become darkened. Because as their knowledge of God fades, and as they're not honoring and giving Him thanks for His blessings, now all of a sudden their behavior is starting to go. And even in the fact that it's going, there's still moments and times where their conscience is going to be kicking in and say, wait a minute, we're not doing right. We're not doing right. And the hope is that eventually people are going to either hear the truth of God, or people are going to seek out the truth of God and say, hey, this is what it is, and respond. And I think that that's one reason why Christianity had such a massive spread in the first century, is because as Paul was going through all these different places where the Gentiles felt this, and they saw the problems, and they saw the extent of all this morality, and they started to fear about judgment that's coming. When Paul comes in and starts to preach the gospel, saying, hey, you guys are wicked and condemned, but I got some good news for you. There is freedom in Jesus Christ. He offers forgiveness, and he's paid the debt for your sins. You can kind of see where all of a sudden now all of this, that turns into the gospel. Okay? All right, you got comments and questions about that one?
I do, but we may want to, put a tag in.
Part two?
It just hit me, so we're all descendants of Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
Why are we not all Jewish, and why are some of us Gentiles? So like I said, that might be something for another time. I don't know.
Well, here's a quick answer for it. Actually, we're all descendants of Noah.
Yeah.
Right, that's what I was thinking too.
And Adam and Eve, too.
Right.
But, Abraham is going to be centuries
Yeah.
after Noah, right? And it's the Jews that are descended from Abraham,
Okay.
And so here's all these other people that aren't descended from Abraham. And when you
And who are
look
they
at
descended from?
what's that?
And who are they descended from?
Who?
The ones that are not.
The Gentiles.
Oh, the Gentile? Well, from Noah.
Well, no, I thought it was real specific. Like,
Well, there's Ham, Shem, and Japheth.
Yeah,
And
but there was a lineage.
Abraham is going to come from Shem.
yeah,
But at the same time, there's a whole bunch of other people that came from Shem too. And so Abraham is just a portion of all the descendants of Shem.
so you had to be descended from Abraham.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it's not even descended from Abraham, it's actually descended from Jacob,
Jacob.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's true.
because Abraham had other children, Ishmael.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was trying to get
Okay.
at. Ishmael is the flip in, like, the Quran.
Right,
They think that Ishmael is the good son.
he's the son of promise, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but you kind of see where that's come from. And so here you got the Gentiles that are, descending in this moral abyss. But even in that moral abyss, you still had people that recognized God. For example, Abraham's dad, Terah, was an idolater. He grew up in Ur of the Chaldees, where idolatry was rampant. So it's kind of like, well, where did Abraham get his knowledge of God? Okay? And so when Abraham came back from defeating the 5 kings, he was met by Melchizedek, who is a high priest of God. Wait a minute. All the people of Canaan were idolaters. Where did this high priest of God come from? Right? So here's Moses, and Moses flees to Midian, and who does he come across? Jethro, who was a priest of God. Where did Jethro come up with that? And wasn't it divine providence for Moses to intersect with him? So you see that even in that morass, there's still people there, pinpoints, that's like, oh no, wait a minute, these people are true, these people are believers in God.
But I think it goes back to Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse.
Yes.
We can draw back to him no matter what
Yeah.
lineage we come from.
Yeah. You're right.
Yeah.
And even in that idea about this,
Yeah.
this mess of people's knowledge of God, when we're talking about the Jews, here is God selecting and choosing a people that he's going to give his law to so that they can have the true knowledge of God, so that he can bless them, and then the whole world is going to be able to see Israel as a witness of himself. Okay? And that concept fails, but it doesn't fail because of God. It fails because of the problem of the Israelites continuing to go back into idolatry, continuing to not follow God and God having to judge them. And then there's the promise of Jesus Christ. So we still need part 2? Okay.
Nope.
All right. Well, we will call it quits right there.